This is probably the panel, this is the only panel that I've moderated out of the 17 sessions that I've done so far, I think. And honestly, I think it's because it's one of the most interesting things that I've learned in the last couple of years, kind of coming up the DC, how things actually work. I made the joke the other day, people go to DC, they think it's West Wing. People on the outside think it's House of Cards, it's Veep, right? So we actually have 3, I'd say, career experts on how things actually work and kind of what it's like to be in this kind of political realm that have worked across 4 presidential administrations over the course of the last 25 years. So I want to start, we're going to get into like a lot of demystifying of how things work, kind of what the state of play is. But Carol, I wanted to start with you to talk about the current administration because you were just in the Biden administration and were involved with the executive order, certainly have been heavily involved in crypto. So when President Biden was elected, I think people were optimistic. They were hopeful that, oh, this guy taught a blockchain course at MIT. That's a good sign, right? Some of these things haven't really aged that well. So what has really been the split between how things started and kind of where we are now, and how did things go off the rails?
So I appreciate you setting me up that way. I remember, sorry, I don't mean as a setup, but I remember when there were leaks coming out about the executive order and industry was so worried that the administration was going to come out and try to kill crypto was the fear that I was hearing. I do want to do a little bit of myth busting if I can, because I know that there's a perception that President Biden and the administration is anti-crypto. The standing guidance from the president was reflected in that executive order, which has a lot of objectives in it around protecting consumers, defending against illicit finance, but also promoting technological development. Things that don't get a lot of air cover often in media, aside from the regulatory actions, are things like the Department of Commerce's competitiveness framework. The fact that there's a research and development strategy being driven by the White House right now for DLT and digital assets. The fact that there's a standard strategy that points to digital assets as a critical emerging technology for U.S. national security. So there are other efforts that are happening. I'm sympathetic on some of the regulatory points. I think that there is some misunderstanding about some enforcement actions that have been underway for many years that have been coming to fruition because they just take a long time. But I also am sympathetic that I know that there's a lot of messaging coming out that is warning about some of the risks on crypto and not always acknowledging the more balanced representation of the benefits that can come from this tech.
Well, personnel is policy, and a former Elizabeth Warren staffer who's one of the most openly hostile or quietly hostile, I don't know, it may be open for folks on this stage, Bharat Ramamurthy just resigned and is stepping back from his advisory capacity in the National Economic Council. So is there an opening, right? Do you think, is this the administration pivoting? Is this just kind of par for the course? Sometimes people leave after the high stress job. Or, is there an opening now that like one of our top opponents inside the White House that actually influences these decisions has stepped aside?
Well, I will say that I am so excited about Lael Brainerd, who was vice chair at the Fed and is currently the chair of the National Economic Council. A lot of folks don't recognize, like when she was vice chair of the Fed, she appointed a chief innovation officer, Sunena Tuteja, who came from hard crypto. Lael has always been, in my view, very focused on innovation and disruption of tech, as well as supporting experimentation that I saw during her time at the Fed. And I feel that she is someone who is still interested in driving innovation in payments in the financial sector. So I think that combined with a lot of the other efforts that are underway at the administration that don't always get coverage are hopefully a very good signal for the direction that the administration will go.
This is someone who's worked in DC for a long time. What do you think of Bharat resigning? Lael's great. That's all you need to hear. So that's the signal between the lines there. Amira, we talk about engagement a lot. I've kind of joked that I don't like that word anymore because it's just it doesn't really mean anything to me. But it is important to have folks that can have these conversations. Brian Armstrong made the point during our conversation yesterday that you have 2 options. One is DC is going to write these regs and these laws without any input, or they're going to write them with input. I think the same applies to conversations with key regulators inside the administration. How do you think about thoughtful engagement when we are very much in the crosshairs, it seems, the last couple of years, right? And when, if any, do those conversations break down, right? Are there things that kind of break those conversations down, or like, to a certain extent, I think a critic would say it's almost like Stockholm syndrome, like we keep going back, thank you, sir, may I have another. You would, I think, very much disagree with that based on our private conversations. But how do you kind of balance this, given the state and kind of tone of this conversation in DC right now?
Yeah, I mean, let's get into it. I think it's important to remember that most policymakers in DC, their stance in crypto isn't pro-crypto or anti-crypto. It's they just don't know, right? If you ever get the chance to go down and walk through, the offices in the Capitol, one of the things that you'll notice is there are tons and tons of groups coming through those offices every day from all over the country, right? They're dealing with crypto, they're dealing with the Pacific Northwest Fishermen's Association, the Church of Latter-day Saints. Like, any given staffer is just meeting so many different people in one day. And so it's just really difficult to keep up with all this new technology, right? And it's very easy to get confused. And so we think about thoughtful engagement. It takes place by actually taking the time to, one, figure out who your senators and member of Congress are, and going and showing them what you're building, right? So starting from a place of anger or frustration, while it does feel often when you're in industry that you've been attacked over and over again, it's not particularly productive because for most people, they haven't actually seen what's being built on the technology, right? For most people in DC, they have no clue what's happening, and their first interaction with crypto is often on crypto Twitter, where they see a lot of anger. That's not a particularly productive conversation, right? What's much more productive is to say, hey, I'm in your district, I'm building this really cool tool that opens up more financial access for more people, or makes it easier for merchants to take payments at lower costs. And I'm in your district, and I'm concerned about what I'm seeing, would love a phone call, or would love to go meet you in person. And the staffers will meet you in person if you show up to DC. And I think that's a much more productive way to start a conversation, because we have to remember most people don't know much about crypto at all. They haven't been steeped in this industry for years, like all the people in this room.
How much of that dynamic do you think comes down to crypto is very much an entrepreneurial, like wide open, Wild West gets thrown out. I think the good and the bad, that's probably true. Versus the environment in DC, which is very risk averse. Is that a fair characterization?
I think if you're someone in government, so my post was in the National Security Council, right? So I was dealing with issues of like prime national security importance, as was Carol. If you're in those seats, risk aversion probably is a good thing, right? Like you don't want to pull the trigger too quickly or make assumptions. You want to be really thoughtful about sort of the decisions that you make. And then you go out in startup worlds, and the idea is like, you want to try things. The risk of making a decision is much lower than compared to when you're like in a seat in the situation room, right? So there is a contrast there. But I think like you'll see that a lot of people in DC are open to entrepreneurs, right? Like one of the great things about America is that we have a foundation of laws that actually celebrates entrepreneurship. You have limited liability, you have bankruptcy protections. Like these are all sort of baked into the cake of American business. So I think there's openness to them, but I think like what they do like to see is that at least entrepreneurs are thinking about the consequences of their action, right? So that when they're asked about issues like consumer protection or illicit finance, the entrepreneurs say, hey, here's how I'm thinking about that, or like, gee, I haven't thought about that. Let me go figure it out and come up with a thoughtful response, as opposed to, you don't get our industry, like you are up to, you just want to squash us, and like you ever laser cross eyes on us and don't believe in what we're doing. Like I don't think that's a productive conversation.
Chris, I don't know if this is true or not, but sometimes perception is reality. And I was first introduced to you, and the back channel one-line description was they literally made a movie with Rob Lowe in a political thriller based on Chris Lehane. So whether that's true or not, or just like very fortunate mythology for you, go ahead.
By the way, Ryan, when that movie came out and Rob Lowe was announced as the featured star, my wife immediately said, no one will ever actually think that's based on you, given the disparity in looks. So
what was the movie?
It's called Knife Fight.
Wow, fun.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
So that is an amazing, kind of backstory to have and mythology. But what I really think it speaks to is your experience and proficiency in navigating these complex relationships, the 4D chess, however you want to put it. And a lot of that often comes down to leverage. So we've spoken about this before, but where do we find points of leverage right now to even have a conversation so that it doesn't all feel like a one-way, like crippling, 15, 18, 24 months that's just relentless hostility versus can we have a conversation about this and let's solve some of the problems that we agree need to be solved, but if the door is, if we can't even get a foothold in any leverage points, how do we even start that?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for having me. I think we may have lined up here in terms of our ideological bent. I'm over here on the far left, which, although Amira and I are pretty close, I think, on things.
I think so, yeah.
And Ryan, thank you for hosting this. I hope everyone gets to see your shirt in full exposure. Excellent. And thank you all for being here for this session. I come out of a political background, and I fundamentally believe that good politics drives good policy. It's actually how a small d democracy is supposed to work. And so your question is the right question. Where do we get, at least in my view, political leverage? Carol, Amir, they do enormously positive work in public service. Thank you for everything that you have done. But we do need to get the politics right on this. And if you think about the fact that there are 52 million Americans who own crypto, Brian Armstrong talked a little bit about this yesterday, I think, with you. Can we organize 1 million of them to get politically engaged? And can we focus that activity on the key states and key districts? So put this in perspective, right? 11,799. You know what that is? That's a number of votes that were the difference between who won and who lost Georgia. 12,000. That's the number of votes between who won and who lost Arizona in the last presidential. 44,000, the number of votes between Georgia, Arizona, Wisconsin that determined the presidency. You have a couple states that will control the Senate. Montana, 18,000 votes in the previous Senate race between whoever won that race. Ohio will be another really important race that will determine the Senate. All of those places are areas where crypto voters over-index. And they also happen to be amongst the single most important voters out there. They're disproportionately young, they're disproportionately non-white, they have incredibly strong views about the fact that the country's going in the wrong direction when it comes to our economics, and feel incredibly strongly and passionate about the role that crypto is going to play in creating a more fair, more open, more inclusive society. We have the potential and opportunity to go out and organize. Look, am I going to tell you that there's going to be 52 million Americans who are going to go marching off on crypto? No. Do I think we can definitely organize 1 million folks and then actually focus it in the key areas? And what does that do? That then begins to align political incentives. I mean, ultimately, what drives elected officials are, do they get elected or reelected or not? And if we can bring the crypto voter to life, make it a reality, then I think good policy begins to flow and cascade from there. I want to be really clear, too. I'm incredibly optimistic about where we are. Like, there is just no question that this is happening. It already has happened. I mean, there's been no point in human history where there are 400 million plus people around the world who have created a currency without a single sovereign entity behind it. Like, that's just a powerful signal. I think the question for me is, how fast do we accelerate change? Change always wins. We are on the side of change. How fast do we make that change happen? And I think doing our politics in a smart, sophisticated way accelerates that change.
I ran a very scientific Twitter poll, as I mentioned last night, and I was being a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but I do think that there's a bit to be learned here based on what you just said, and it was very simple. It was, what best describes you in 2024? You are a Republican voting Republican, you are a Democrat voting Democrat, you're a Democrat voting Republican, and basically the four boxes. And I do think it was a high signal poll, given that I'm going to naturally have a Twitter following. So on behalf of all of crypto Twitter, I would say this is maybe a representative sample of people that could be swung.
Yep.
It was 50-50 in terms of people who identified Democrat voting Republican or Democrat voting Democrat. And yet the GOP comes out in that poll 77-23. When you look at that as someone that's been in electoral politics, how big of a swing issue can that be when you have 27 points of a swing in a key demographic, and when you try to add up to 12,000 or 11,799 or 44,000, if you do the straight multiplication, it seems like we could be right on the line where this particular demographic, the people that really care and are deep in crypto, that could swing a few states.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the presidential and you look at the Senate, and you look at the House. House, 20 to 30 seats that will be up for grabs. Senate, 3 to 5 seats. Presidency, 3 or 4 states that will determine it. Each of those places are micro thin in terms of what the delta is between who wins and who loses. And so when you consider that these elections rise and fall on sort of micro voters or micro bands of voters, and you know that there is this huge potential block out there, if that block can be organized, suddenly elected officials begin to think, hey, being for crypto is actually good for me, and probably even more importantly, being against crypto is bad for me. And once you start to have elected officials begin to think about that, right, just the whole mindset on the shifts. I mean, Carol and Amara, you guys are both in White Houses, worked in governments. I worked in the White House. Each White House is a little bit different in terms of how it's run. But, typically at the end of every week, the political team, president, vice president, get together around the table and talk politics. And when this issue starts to come up in those conversations, we are winning.
Amira, we talked about engagement, and we're having parallel conversations. On the one hand, we're saying, I want to swing 4 Senate seats from blue versus red based on this single issue. And then you're going to try to go on the back of that. I'm going to tweet about it, as you know. And you're going to try to have a constructive conversation with someone in the administration. That's a hard balance beam to walk. I understand that. So how do you keep engaged here? And going back to leverage, do you have a little bit more leverage of, I am on your side. I would, this is my politics. I would like this administration to succeed. I would like the country to succeed. But this issue is going to get you killed in the next election if we don't find a way to be a little bit more constructive. Like, is that something where you're constantly on the defensive with these dynamics, or is that an opportunity to say, tap the brakes and give us a little bit of air cover because we're on the same team?
Well, I think it's important to go back to sort of the values that you can align with whatever party you're in, right? So it's no secret I'm a Democrat. You can Google that. My democratic values are what brought me to crypto, right? I believe in a more open, accessible financial system. I believe that too much power has accrued in the hands of too few people, and I want to look for new ways that we can reconfigure the system. I don't think those are controversial things to say. I think, as you said, I think 90% of people in the US are really frustrated with the current financial system. And so what I find is effective when I speak to people who have similar politics to me is when I go back to those values and talk about what is similar there, right? So I think sometimes it can be difficult to say, hey, crypto is the issue that's going to kill you, although I think in some political situations, the people who are sort of thinking through those campaigns have found that crypto is a key issue. I think what is much more palatable or powerful is to be able to link it to the priorities that these politicians do care about and that voters do care about, right? What are the big priorities right now for the Democratic administration, or for, I think, a lot of voters? Climate change, inflation, economic equality. These are all issues that are relevant to crypto and that you can link back to when it comes to talking to these folks. And so I think if you can draw the line between why you care about this technology and why that links to their priorities, that's when you really have the aha moments. And if you look at the progressives in Congress who are really pro-crypto, that's what they'll go back to a lot. They'll say, like, people should have the chance to build here. They should have the chance to be able to experiment with this new technology. It's revealing that 52 million Americans have owned crypto, right? A lot of people are trying to figure out, like, how can I interact with this new financial system? And so if you can draw that line for them, I think that's when you can have really effective conversations.
Is it okay if I tag on that?
Yes.
I really appreciate that point because I think it also connects, interestingly, to some stuff that Chris talked about. Crypto still has an optics issue, not just with policymakers, but even with the general public. I think that's changing, and over time, more access and exposure to it by people will help them understand. Every time that I teach in a class and I ask, like, what do you think crypto is? Do you think it's pictures of gorillas, an investment instrument, or something that could reshape the future of a consumer-driven economy that will, like, create a new internet for you? And most of the time, it's the investment instrument is the answer that I get from everyone. And I think that that's still a misunderstanding, and why you get some policymakers that are conflating issues where you see people that generally should be pushing for a change from the status quo, not embracing a technology that inherently defends progressive values when implemented properly with necessary controls to protect consumers, and has built-in features for transparency that can defend exactly those objectives. So I think, unfortunately, we've seen that I think electoral candidates don't do super well campaigning on crypto, but if they campaign on issues, on the values, on the implications of supporting crypto, on it providing a mechanism for giving an alternative to the existing financial system, on promoting competitiveness with China and just driving innovation in payments and promotion of U.S. technological leadership, those are the kinds of issues that I think that generally you will see being campaigned on more frequently than crypto being the campaign issue, but it's still being something that people vote on because they're supporting crypto positions. But Chris, I'm curious if you think that's right.
No, I think both of you have made really incredible points, and I'll just share a little bit of my experience. And I've been talking about this crypto voter. What I didn't mention is that 61% of those folks who hold crypto or held crypto in 2020 voted for Joe Biden. Right? These are actually, Ryan, I hope you don't mind me saying this, these are actually Democratic voters that Democrats actually are at risk of losing if they don't engage with them. And where this connects up with the incredibly important points that you both made is on the values piece, right? It's not that they're just a lot of people. It's not just that they're politically relevant folks. It is the fact that why they are involved with crypto is a values-based issue, right? These young people who are really, really upset with the current economic system, who feel like it has not been fair, who feel like it has not been inclusive, who understand that 90% of the wealth is controlled by 10% of the world, right? They get all of that. They grew up through 2008 and 2009. They've come through the pandemic. They've just been impacted in a really interesting way. And so when you put them, to Amira's point, in a room with an elected official, and that official looks at who these folks are, and they explain why they are interested in crypto, like the conversation changes. I'm a Democrat. I'm pretty far on the left. Like, I was attracted to crypto because it's inherently, the underlying technology is inherently progressive. It's decentralized. It doesn't, I haven't seen anything ever that distributes economics and can create an ownership society. You have a UAW strike going on right now. You have a writer's strike going on right now in Hollywood. Imagine if you're in Hollywood and you can own your IP. Yeah. Right? And put it on the blockchain. Imagine if you're in Detroit and suddenly you can actually create a smart contract that gives you a piece of that car going on forever. And that's a little bit out there in the future, but certainly you can start to think about what an ownership society looks like. And so this is a long-winded way of saying once those voters get in front of those elected officials and begin having those kinds of conversations, like you connect the values with their political interests, and that's a powerful one too.
I think generally the labels are unhelpful. I think for a panel like this, it is helpful to kind of make the case that we are probably sitting in descending order of the political rainbow here. But having said that, I think red versus blue is almost a false construct with respect to crypto because there is not much difference between the Warrenites and the neocons, right? So the extreme fringe of the left at this point bears a lot of similarities to the hard right of the early 2000s, and a lot of the folks that I think have agitated for some of the early wars in the Middle East. And then on the other hand, folks like Senator Wyden, who were like the OG progressive civil libertarian Democrats in the 90s, and frankly, people like Senator Wyden helped protect the open internet in those previous crypto wars, share a lot of similarities with like the libertarian and more populist right today. So you've almost got, like, again, going back to this 2x2 matrix, I do think that like we're on the diagonal right now, and you've got these two wings that are diametrically opposed in so many areas, but they're actually like uniform on the one area that I think crypto voters are sick of talking about.
I hear you. I'm saddened by what I think is often a very unhelpful polarization that's happening, where one side says the government shouldn't do money, and we should trust these giant corporations without any controls, despite the effects on markets and consumers that we've seen with lack of proper regulation.
Well, it's not even polarization so much as like Freaky Friday in some cases.
Yes.
Like the poles shifting.
I get you. And then on the other side, and like ignoring that innovation comes from industry, and that just because you make money doesn't mean that you're inherently evil or not going to drive and build in the right protections, especially if you regulate properly, which involves getting a right balance between things like transparency and security that was discussed earlier today. But anyway, so I hear you that there's a lot of things where I think bucketing it as blue and red is not always is not always very helpful in the context of crypto.
I want to come back to you for one other point. I think people think about the three branches of government and often neglect the intersection and the relationships that exist. One of the reasons that we are in this position with the Biden administration ties all the way back to the election of 2020, where Elizabeth Warren ran for president and now has incredible influence after she had stepped aside and was able to place some key allies in financial services points. And now she also has outsized influence being the second most senior member of the Senate Banking Committee, which actually governs some of these financial regulators. So how closely tied are these back offices, right? So I don't think anyone thinks that the first thing that Joe Biden thinks about in the morning, and I'm going to save some of my spicier jokes, but I don't think the first thing that people think,
Not yet.
That Joe after backstage, yeah. I don't think the first thing that he thinks about in the morning is whether we should have a spot Bitcoin ETF, right? I don't think that's on his radar, right? This is not one of the top 3 or even maybe top 10 issues, and this is something that he personally would delegate, and now it's getting a rung or two down. And so the question is, like, who are the people that are getting delegated to? So kind of going back to the question of the insiders, my question is not so much what's happening in the administration, but if we have a closed door to folks in key positions in the Senate and key staffers that are on the Senate or the House side, is that also trickling through to the White House, in the same quarters?
Well, I can at least speak to when I was there. It was not a closed door at all. It was a very open door. We engaged with anyone who ever asked me for a meeting. Like, we said yes to it, and that's a part of providing like an equally open door to anyone, no matter their political leaning, but being willing to have that engagement. You're right that certainly President Biden. I mean, he is very close with a lot of people on the Hill, including some Republicans. But you're right. Like, there's a lot of senators that he's very close with, and there's a lot of staff that came from whether it's Brown staff or Warren staff, CFPB and other places that still hold really key positions in the administration, and that's something that like I said, sometimes the industry has an optics problem where when they would come into message, there really wasn't always a very good job on engaging on things like financial inclusion and progressive values that I think are inherent in the space, but that the industry really hadn't come together to coalesce around metrics to defend this as a policy point. A lot of the messages were the same ones that I heard under a Trump administration at the regulator, FinCEN. So I do think that there's certainly a lot of closeness. I would encourage industry to continue to engage. I do think that the administration will continue to engage industry, and I know that there's still consistently meetings. I was just at one the Department of Commerce hosted recently, so the administration is still consistently engaging this space on its key priorities. In the White House, I don't work there anymore, so I would encourage folks to continue to go there. But I certainly hope that they'll be proactive and engaging.
So we talked about 2 of the 3. This conversation came up last night about whether crypto and crypto policy proponents will be successful in DC if they are perpetually viewed as the opposition party, right? On the other hand, we look at the conservative courts and the wins that the industry has racked up by standing on some of these principles and fighting. How do we thread that needle? Because when I see wins in the courts, I think maybe we're not the crazy ones, right? And maybe standing on some of these principles is the right strategy, and if the other side is being unreasonable, then we should continue to fight that out and kind of live to fight another day when there is a little bit more balance in the executive and the legislative chambers. How do we what's the nicest thing that I could say on Twitter without pandering?
What's the nicest thing? What?
That I could say on Twitter without pandering. That would be constructive. When it comes to being forcefully opposed to some of the things that we think might be constitutional overreaches or where the administrators are running rogue. Chris wants to weigh in too.
Yeah, go ahead. No,
yeah, please. No, please.
She'll be smarter, so I'll go after her.
Okay.
I don't. I appreciate
you look like
the
you were thinking
deference.
about it.
I don't know if I can live up to that.
Yeah.
I think the nicest things you can say on Twitter are going back to sort of substantive policy issues that really engage directly in maybe what you see in the executive order, in the legislation, in the different court cases, and really address them directly. I don't think what is useful is, we talked about this last night, I think like declarations of war I don't think are very useful. Like I think really inflammatory language is helpful for getting retweets, but I think it's important to know that like people on Capitol Hill and people who work at the White House and people who work at courts, they have access to Twitter too. But what they don't have as much access to is sort of the conversations where they can get into the depth of, sort of what you might really mean when you say something that is like good at getting a lot of attention, but not necessarily great at opening up conversation. So it's the boring answer, right? But I think, there's a lot of, I think what's very powerful is there's a lot of very well-placed op-eds, for example, people writing Medium posts, people writing on Substack. That stuff gets around too. And I think there, maybe less higher leverage, but still very effective ways to get eyes of people who are engaging in these policy matters.
Chris, there's plenty of Super Bowl champions that have had bend but don't break defenses. Is that the moment that we're at? That's another way to ask a question.
Well, first of all, I want to say, whenever you hear Amira talk, I'm reminded of having seen her do meetings with elected officials, and she should be called the closer. She always closes so well with those elected officials. So yes, absolutely. So 2 tweets. Democrats just regulate. That's what Democrats do, right? All you're asking is to actually regulate an industry. Secondly, 1932. And why do I say 1932? 1932 was before the 1933 SEC was created and the Securities Acts were created. And to your legal point, right, you've had a series of cases where Democratic appointed judges have ruled against the SEC. It's almost unheard of for the SEC to take a case and lose. You have Democratic judges ruling against them. If they appeal those, you start to work your way up through the appellate process. Given what has happened with the courts, regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum, it's objectively the case that they become more and more conservative. If you're going to take this all the way up to a Supreme Court, you've got a Supreme Court that is begging for cases. Again, I disagree with where they are on this politically, but just for this particular issue, they're begging for cases where they can severely constrain the jurisdiction of different agencies. Like they've done this in a series of rulings. If you're the next SEC chair in 2025, right, regardless of who wins, there's likely to be a new SEC chair. Do you want to be sitting on top of these cases and running the risk, and Democrats running the risk, of a court saying, actually, not only does the SEC not have any jurisdiction over this, or very limited, but potentially rolling the SEC's jurisdiction back beyond even the crypto sector. That is a huge roll of the dice. And I think that dice is loaded when you look at who this particular court is. Again, to be clear, I don't like where this court is, but that is something that next SEC chair is going to have to give an awful lot of thought to. And would it make a lot more sense to actually not roll a bunch of loaded dice, but instead actually pursue rulemaking? That was a long tweet.
Yeah. Yeah, Elon changed the format.
Yes, you could do a whole, yes.
Now I can do 7,000 characters. Last lightning round question, because we got a couple minutes here. It's always difficult to pass legislation. It seems like a sub 5% chance, sub 1% chance, not to deflate anyone that's working on this, but it seems like a long shot, we'll put it that way, for this to move. Or this collection of bills to move over the course of the next 15 months going into an election year when things are this fragmented. How do people stay engaged, and is it all about the election and all about the courts at this point, or what percentage of time should people be spending on the single issue voting side, as the title of the panel is, versus like the ongoing dialogue, the ongoing like kind of trench warfare of ultimately trying to eke out progress through rulemaking, legislation, and how lawmakers are thinking about this? I'll start with you, Carol.
Yeah, of course, I want people to engage on the rulemaking and regulatory piece, because so much has to be done by the existing regulators already under existing authorities. I think that there needs to be a lot of engagement to get that balance between like privacy, security, transparency, all calibrated properly. So I think I'm hopeful that there could be something, but under a split Congress when next year is this presidential election cycle. I don't know if we're going to get anything through Congress without very serious senior administration engagement.
I'll just offer this, which is every once in a while when I'm tracking all of this, I'm like, this is the way politics was supposed to work. Like, legislation was built to take a long time to get through. These three branches of government were supposed to counterbalance each other. So while it's very, very frustrating, this is the process that the founding fathers constructed 225 years ago, playing out in real time. And a key piece of that is legislators' responsiveness to voters. And so I will never give up on engagement because I'm a believer in the system. I'm an America maxi, right? And so I think engagement is really critical. And these things will continue to play out in the courts as well. We'll have the presidential, but I don't think you can underweight engagement at all. I think we should go all in and engage more.
Chris, last question to you, or are we in a knife fight?
Yeah, so we had dinner last night. One of our friends described himself as a romantic in terms of eras and thinking about legislation. I will boil it down to this. There's a saying in politics, early to bed, early to rise, work like hell and organize. If we organize 1 million crypto voters, you incentivize those elected officials from both parties to support good policy. That's what we can do over the next year. If the crypto voter emerges by the first Tuesday in November of 2024, we will accelerate change. And the awesome thing about that is that incredibly talented people like these two, hopefully from my perspective, will be back in government pursuing good policy, and they'll create a new position of the head of propaganda for yourself.
And you know what? I would love nothing more. And the difference between Republican and Democratic administrations is that we hire Democratic staffers every once in a while when they're good on this. So thank you very much. This is a great panel. And hopefully this helped demystify some of what's going on in D.C. And we're all friends. Chris and I are on the same team in this particular issue. So
that's the beauty of crypto.
Thank you so much, Ryan.
Thank you. The sky is falling.